Hello everyone, welcome to today's video. In today's video, we will be talking about exception handling in Java, and this topic is extremely important both from the aspect of your academics as well as in interviews also. And we will in today's video we will be talking about the preliminary introduction about exception handling. What are the different types of, what is the exception hierarchy, what are the different types of exception we can handle, and we will also try to find out the difference between errors and exceptions. Now, moving ahead, let me first give you a very small real world example so that we can relate actually how this exception, or what is exception, uh, how an exception plays an important role in our programs. Now, suppose we want our program to execute in a normal flow, right? So if we have certain lines of code, we would like that each of the lines of code would execute in a normal process without getting any interruptions in between or any um, roadblocks in between, right? So suppose, let us consider a specific scenario, and that scenario, a real world scenario, where in this scenario we wake up, there is a person who would wake up in the morning, okay, who would wake up in the morning, get ready for his classes, and let's say he takes a cycle to his class. So when cycle to his class, and finally he reaches his class, okay. So this student, he wakes up in the morning, gets ready, okay. The ready means he takes his bag and he gets ready with his all his activities in the morning, and then he takes a bike ride or a cycle ride to the college or to his classes. So this is what, this is the normal flow of a student, of that student's life. So this is the normal flow of a student's life, of his day-to-day activities. Now suppose what happens is, during his normal flow of his daily activity, suppose he got his tire punctured, or let's say he met with an accident. So when he meets with an accident, what happens is his normal flow gets interrupted. That means either he will reach his classes very late, or he might not reach also, because he might have to go to the hospital or something like that. So his normal flow of the entire day or the daily activity gets interrupted. Or let us say there is some another unwanted event, like rain comes, there is rain at some point or some juncture of his journey. So what happens, that will also cause a delay in his journey to his classes, or he might have to halt for some time or find out an alternative way in order to reach his class. So this situation in a normal flow of a student's daily life is known as an exception, okay. So this is basically an unexpected unexpected event, or an unwanted event which is interrupting the day to day or the normal flow, okay, which is not letting the normal flow of the program to take place. So normal flow will not take place here. So formally, if we have to define exception, so exception in a formal note can be defined as an unwanted or an unexpected event. So let me write it down for you. So an exception is an unwanted or an unexpected event which will occur or which occurs during the execution of a program, during the execution of a program. So this will, what it will do, it will simply interrupt the normal execution of the program, and it happens at runtime. We will talk about this runtime and compile time issues after some time, but as of now let us remember it at runtime, and which will disrupt, which that disrupts the normal flow of the program, normal flow of the program So this is basically what exceptions are. Not problem, it is program. Okay, so what happens is we have to understand two important things. First of all, it is an event, okay, and it is unwanted or it is unexpected, and it will occur during the execution of the program. That means during runtime only, and it will disrupt the normal flow of the program. Okay, so this we have to understand that if I'm already having a program, that means I am having some lines of code to be executed, and these lines of code generally, if it executes in a normal flow, and if this normal flow is interrupted at some point or disrupted at some point by some unwanted or unexpected event, then we can call that an exception has occurred. Okay, now suppose let me give you an example for this. So suppose I have a program with the name is class ABC. Okay, class ABC. So this class ABC, here let me write down the main method as public static void main, and then string arguments, and after that inside this main method I will be writing down a few print statements or display statements, which is system dot out dot print ln 1. Then maybe I have another one which says 2. Okay, and then let's say I have another one which will print 100 divided by 50, and then let's say I have another one which says 4, etc. Okay, so when I'm trying to compile this particular program will get compiled, and the output that it is getting generated is basically 1, 200 divided by 50 is 2, then 4. So this is the output that this particular program would be generating. Now instead of 100 divided by 50, what do I write is 100 divided by 0. So when I'm trying to do this, what happens is, what should be the output that I should get here? So I will get an exception here, or I will get an interruption here, or a disruption here in the form of an exception. So, and my output would just be generated till 1, 2, and after that I will get a divide by this will be throwing me an exception. Okay, it will give me an exception saying that there is an arithmetic exception which has occurred. So arithmetic exception is a class of exceptions. Okay, so arithmetic exception which has occurred, and it is known as divide by 0. Okay, so that it has a problem in this particular program, and it will not be executing beyond this particular point. Okay, so 4 will not be displayed. So we will not have 4 as a output in this entire program, right? So this is how an exception occurs, or this is how the normal flow of a particular program is interrupted using, or when an unwanted or an unexpected event occurs in the form of an exception. Okay, and next we will talk about is exception handling. So exception handling is basically a mechanism. Exception handling, so this is basically nothing but a mechanism in which we can handle the exception. That means if we are mechanism by which exception is handled, exception is handled. So this is basically nothing but finding out an alternate way, okay, an alternate way in order to identify, or alternate way in order to handle that exception. That means when I'm talking about exception handling, it does not mean in my previous scenario, suppose I'm considering this example, I'm not ruling out the fact that I will not meet with an accident at all, or I cannot stop the rain. Okay, so what I can do is, under this scenario, if there is rain, I can immediately take out a raincoat and wear it so that it protects me from the rain, and I can reach my classes on time. Okay, and suppose in the next scenario, if I'm meeting with an accident, based on the severity of the accident, if that accident is not severe, I will simply add first aid in use certain first aid, and I can ride to my classes without missing out on the timelines. So that is what we are trying to mean by exception handling. We are not trying to rule out the fact that this will not occur, or we cannot delete this kind of unwanted event or unwanted activities. However, we can find an alternate way in order to handle that particular exception, okay, or handle that particular unwanted event, and that mechanism by which we are identifying an alternate way in order to handle that exception is known as exception handling. We will talk about more of this as and when this session progresses, and also in my subsequent sessions. But before we actually go into exception handling, we have to know about the exception hierarchy. So talking about the exception hierarchy, so I'll write it down here as exception hierarchy. So this hierarchy is extremely important because we have to understand from where or what are the classes that the exceptions are trying to inherit. Okay, so one thing we have to remember is that the object is the parent class of all the classes in Java. This we have already been discussing in my previous sessions as well. So we have to remember that the object, basically it is the parent class of all the classes in Java. From there we are having another class which is known as throwable, and this is basically pertaining to exception handling. Okay, this will be considering exception handling mechanisms or exception handling in Java. So throwable class basically inherits the parent class, which is the object class, and throwable is the parent class of the exception class. So we can consider that whatever exceptions we will be discussing, all of them, they are inheriting the throwable class, which is the parent class. So here we can mention that it is the parent class of all exceptions. So this throwable class. And now talking about throwable class, this parent class considers two different types of classes. One is known as the exception, and the other one is known as the error. Okay, so the other one is known as the error. Talking about the differences between exceptions and errors. So this is one of the most potential questions which is asked, that what is the basic difference between an exception and an error. So we have to understand that there are a few points which are related to exceptions and errors. So first important point is, exceptions are basically they occur in the programs, or due to the programmer's logic. Okay, so it occurs in the programs. However, if we are considering errors, errors are they occur because of the lack of system resources. Okay, so they will occur because of the lack of system resources. Okay, so if there is certain error, this errors basically occur due to, let's say, less memory or less resources. Okay, so lack of system resources. So this is the first important point that we have to understand, and the programmer cannot do anything about these errors. Okay, so the programmers can just handle exceptions in programs. They, because they occur, exceptions occur in programs. However, they cannot handle errors because it is related to the system. Okay, the second important point that we have to discuss related to this exception is the difference between exception and error. The second point is that these exceptions are recoverable. That means, since it is it happens in the program and it occurs in the program, we can easily modify the program, modify the logic, syntax, etc., and these exceptions are recoverable. And because the programmer has nothing to do with the errors and it occurs completely at the system level, hence these errors are not recoverable. They are not recoverable. And the third important point is that, so they are basically of two types. These two types consider runtime and compile time exception. So runtime exception, they are also known as unchecked exceptions. We will also talk about checked and unchecked exception. Unchecked exceptions and compile time, they are basically the checked exceptions. Checked exceptions. And on the other hand, in errors, we can have only one type of exception, which is just one type of exception, which is your runtime exception. And runtime exception, as already mentioned, we can also call it as a unchecked exception. Okay, so these are the primary difference between an exception and an error. So errors, once again, let us discuss errors. They occur in the at the system level and the programmers can do nothing about it. It is not recoverable also, and it consists of just one type of exception, which is known as the runtime exception or unchecked exception. However, in exceptions, they occur in the program. So all the errors, the syntactical errors, all the other types of errors which we are handling at present, they are basically exceptions. They are not errors. Okay, so exceptions, they occur in the programs and they are recoverable because it is some problem with the program. It is at the software level. Okay, so it is, that is why it is recoverable. And there are two different types of exceptions. It is the runtime exception and compile time exceptions. So they are also known as checked and unchecked exception. So we will also talk about checked and unchecked exception in this video in the later part. Now, talking about the hierarchy. So if we move ahead with the hierarchy, let me write it once again in this. Yes, so here, as already mentioned, object is the parent class. from here we have the parent class of all exception, which is the throwable. As already mentioned, throwable has two different categories, two different classes. So we have exception and we have errors. So exception and error. Yes. So now in exception, there are in this particular hierarchy, we will be primarily focusing on the important classes which are there. However, there are thousands of exceptions and thousands of errors which are there in Java, but in this particular hierarchy we will be just be pointing out some of the main classes of exceptions. Okay, so here let me first divide it according to the compile time and runtime exceptions. So first class of exception is the class not found exception. So all of these are a single word. Okay, so I believe all of us know that in Java all the classes they should have a single word. So class not found exception, let me just draw it in this way so that it becomes easier for us to identify. Okay, the next type is no such method, no such method exception. The third type is IO exceptions. So IO exceptions are widely used. And so input output exception, they again have three different types, like end of file exception, end of file exception. Then we have file not found exception, file not found exception. Then again we have, let's say, interrupted IO, interrupted IO exception. Then again different type of different class is there, which is SQL exception. And then we have remote exception. So these are some of the widely used or most popularly used exception categories when it comes to the exception hierarchy. So and we also have to understand that these type of exceptions, they belong to the runtime, they belong to the compile time exception. So whatever we have discussed in this particular branch, they are basically the compile time exceptions. And we have next we have the runtime exception. Runtime exception. And in this runtime exception, again we have several other classes of exceptions, and we will name them one by one. The error part we will be doing it in the next slide. So if we are considering the runtime exception here, so the first one is the arithmetic exception. The second one is class cast exception. Then we have null pointer exception. Then we have index out of bound, index out of bounds exception. Then we have illegal argument exception. Index out of bound exception has some different subclasses, which is array index out of bound exception, string index out of bound exceptions. So those are also some of the classes of exceptions under index out of bound exception class of the runtime exception, under the exception category. Okay, so illegal argument exception, argument exception. Under this we have again number format exception, etc. So these are just some of the important classes of exception. However, there might be thousands of such exceptions which are built inside Java, and we may make use of any one of these exceptions or any multiple of these exceptions in our programs in order to handle these exceptions both at the compile time and the runtime. Error on the other hand, so this is just a continuation of this part. Okay, so error on the other hand, they are simply considering the runtime exceptions, and here also, since it is at the system level, so we will be having virtual machine error, virtual machine error. uh, just for our convenience and for our remembrance, we have to understand that all of this are the same word, virtual machine error. And here we have stack overflow error, then we have out of memory error. So these errors, they basically occur at the system level and occur due to lack of resources. So there are other such classes of errors here. So next we have here is the linkage error. Linkage error again will have verify error. Then we have class format error. Then we have no class definition found error. Found error, etc. So this again might have several other, but these are some of the main errors which are there. Okay, then we also have assertion errors. So all these errors, they cannot be handled at the program level. Okay, because they do not occur at the program level, so the programmers can do nothing about it, and it is not recoverable as well. So if we are considering the hierarchy, this is the hierarchy of the exception, where we have compile time exception and we have runtime exceptions, and we also talked about the errors. So errors basically, they as already mentioned in the difference, that they have only runtime exception. So whatever is under error, all of these are basically the runtime exceptions. So this is the hierarchy of the exception, of the entire exceptions which are there, or which might be there. And we have to understand that the throwable is the parent class of the exceptions, of all exceptions. Okay, so whenever we are considering any exceptions in our program or any exceptions in the system, then we have to understand that the exception class is extending the throwable class. Okay, so throwable is the parent of all exceptions which are there, right? So on the other hand, we saw that the unchecked exception, what was the unchecked exception? So unchecked exception is happens at the runtime. So all the runtime exceptions, they are considered as the unchecked exception, whereas in the compile time exception, these exceptions I'm talking about, they are basically the checked exception. Now we will talk about checked and unchecked exceptions so that it becomes easier for us to understand what do we actually mean by checked and unchecked, or runtime and compile time exception. Now whenever we are talking about this checked and unchecked exceptions, okay, so I will write down the heading as checked and unchecked exception. So whenever we are considering this, what happens is there is a wrong concept which or we can also consider this as compile time exception and this as runtime exception. So whenever a question is asked that what is compile time and runtime exception, so the general answer everyone says is that compile time exceptions, they occur at the compile time, and runtime exceptions, they occur at the runtime. But that particular concept is entirely wrong, because we have to understand one thing, that all exceptions, they take place at runtime, or they occur at runtime only. So the occurrence of these exceptions, they are at runtime only. Okay, they are not at compile time. At compile time, it is just giving us a check, okay, or a warning signal, or not a check, not a warning signal. It basically gives us a direction that there might be a error in your program, or there might be an exception in your program. Now if we are considering the previous example, that a person wakes up, okay, a person wakes up from the bed, a student basically, and he gets ready for classes, okay, and then he rides a bike to his college, right? He rides a bike to his college, and he reaches the classes on time. So his classes, he reaches on time. So this is a normal flow of the program. Now when he is doing that, so when this person is doing this, what happens is, suppose there is another entity which is giving a check to his normal routine. Okay, let's say he is the father of that particular person or particular student. So this father is giving certain checks to him before he goes out of the house, saying that whether he has uh, taken his identity card, or whether he has taken his purse along with him, or whether he has taken his bags along with him, or his assignment along with him. This kind of checks the father gives to this particular student, so that he does not face any problem when he is attending his classes, or he is about to attend his college. Okay, otherwise if he does not carry his identity card, he will not be allowed inside the college, or if he is not taking his assignment, he might face certain problem in the class. So all these checks, basically it is given by the father before the person executes his normal routine, okay, before the person reaches his classes. So this particular person who is giving the check, this is nothing but the compiler, who is giving a check to the program that you might be facing certain problems in your execution, or during your execution, and these are the things that you have to take care of. Okay, but what happens is, there might be some unwanted event, okay, some unwanted event which the father cannot assume. Okay, so there might be unwanted event like traffic, there might be unwanted event like an accident, or there might be an unwanted event like the rain. So all these events, the father cannot keep a check on, or the compiler or the father simply ignores about this fact. These events might occur, but the father will simply ignore about this fact, or generally cannot comprehend, cannot anticipate certain things. okay, related to this unwanted events. So these events which happens at runtime, these things cannot be checked by the compiler. Okay, so hence the things which can be checked by the compiler during compilation stage, okay, or before the execution of the program starts, so they are basically your checked type of exception. And whatever we cannot check during the execution of the program, that will be your unchecked or runtime exceptions. However, even though the father can check for different types of parameters like the ID card, like assignments, so all these things, even if it could check, it will just it is not so that the event has occurred at that time. That means if he does not have the ID card, then he will face problem while attending his classes. The problem will not start when he is at home, right? So if he is not carrying his assignment to his class, he might face issues inside the class, but when he is inside the home, he or wakes up, he does not face any issue, right? So hence this is what we are trying to understand, that the all the exceptions, they basically do not occur, the even the we name it as compile time exception, it does not occur at compile time, it occurs only at runtime. Okay, that means only it starts after it starts executing the program, right? So we have to understand that whatever the compiler can check before actually executing the program, and all those exceptions we can consider it as the compile time exception. However, there are certain exceptions which occurs during the runtime, and those exceptions the compiler will not be able to check. However, both compile time exception and runtime exceptions, they generally occur during the runtime. They not generally, they always occur at runtime only. Okay, now let us look into an example. Okay, so first I have a class, let's say ABC, and this class has a main method, public static void main string arguments, and inside the body of this particular class, what will I write? I will create an object of file input stream class, input stream, let's say f is equal to new file input stream, and within this, let's say I am trying to read a file known as abc.txt. Okay, so this is file handling, creating a file object. Okay, so this we will do in details when we do file handling in Java, but as of now, just remember that I am trying to create a new file input stream object or new object, and I'm trying to read a file which is abc.txt in my present in my C drive. Okay, and for this file program to get executed, I have to import a class which is under IO, which is known as file input stream. So this is the program. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create an object which is reading a file, which will read a file from this particular location. Now just imagine that I have not in my C drive, let's say this is my C drive. Okay, in my C drive, I do not have this file abc.txt present. Okay, so when I'm trying to compile this in the compilation stage itself, so when I'm trying to compile this in my compilation stage itself, there will be an error, or there will be an indication saying that there is an unreported exception. Unreported exception which is likely to occur, okay, which is likely to occur. And here, since the file is not present in the C drive, I will get a file not found exception. File not found exception. But in the compilation stage, that means when I am doing Java C, then A B C dot Java. So when I'm doing this, essentially this will give me this particular error saying that there will be an unreported exception. However, the exception has not occurred at this stage. The exception will occur only when I will run this particular program. Okay, that means Java ABC. So when I'm running this, then I will get that there is a exception which has occurred as file not found exception. Otherwise, until compilation stage, I will just get an unreported exception, which is file not found exception, and it has to be caught or declared to be thrown. That means we have to handle that particular exception either using the try catch block or the throwable throws or throwable classes. So and we have to uh, find an alternate way of handling this particular exception. However, this unreported exception will get converted into an exception, or the exception will actually occur at this point when we are trying to execute this. Okay, so I believe this much we have understood that the exception will not occur at the compile time. That means the compiler will just give us an indication that there might be an exception because the file might not be present in the C drive. Okay, so this is what the compiler is trying to tell us. So now if we associate the try catch block here, so let me simply rub this. So if I'm trying to associate the try catch block here, okay, so this try catch block and all of this we will be discussing in our subsequent session when we actually will try to understand how we can handle these exceptions. So just for our preliminary knowledge, so if I'm trying to use a try catch block, so we have to report that particular unreported exception. So system.out.println, and here we will print E. So this will basically report the unreported exception error which we are getting in the compile time. Okay, so using this try catch block we will be able to handle that particular exception or report that particular exception, right? So now if we have to understand that, so this is a type of compile time exception, or this is a type of checked exception. This checked exception is occurring because we in at the compile time itself we are getting an unreported error or an unreported exception saying that there might be an exception which would occur because the file might not be present. Okay, and if we are still not handling it, it will give us at the runtime when we are running it, it will give us an error saying that there is an exception which has occurred and the program will not be executed, right? Now this is a typical example of a checked exception or a compile time exception. Okay, so if we are considering this kind of exceptions, so all the compile time exceptions, this will be under this category, and this kind of things would be there. That means in the compile time itself we will get an indication that there is an unreported exception, okay, that we need to report immediately. Now in another example where we will be discussing about the unchecked exception. Suppose now I have another class which is class X, Y, and Z. Okay, let me give a very use class test. Okay, so here what I am doing is public static void main, and then the main method is declared here string arguments. So here what I'll try to do is inside the body of the main method, inside the method definition, let us write down integer a is equal to 50. Okay, then b is equal to 0, then c, where c is equal to a divided by b, and I am trying to print the value of c, system.out.println c. Okay, so when I'm trying to do this, what is the problem that I will face here? The problem I will face here is that initially when I'm compiling this, okay, so initially when I'm compiling this, that means I am doing java c test.java. When I'm doing this, it will not show me any unreported error or unreported exception here. Why? Because logically 50 divided by 0, syntactically this is correct, but logically this is not correct, right? Because we cannot divide this integer value by 0, it will give us an infinite number. So you can see that since this is not logically correct, um, that is why there might be a problem in the output of this particular program. However, there is no such no such syntactical error or no such programmatical error which should be interrupting the normal flow of the program apart from the logical consequences. Hence, it will compile fine. Okay, it will not show any error here, or it will not show any unreported warning here. However, during the execution time, it will show an exception, or it will throw an exception saying that it has the arithmetic exception, that is divide by 0. Okay, so in runtime exceptions or in unchecked exceptions, we do not have any clear idea, or the compiler does not have any clear idea about whether this exception would occur or not. Instead, it will compile fine but throw an exception when it is only executing that particular program. Okay, so now talking about the difference between checked and unchecked exception. So the first point, we have already seen that it is handled at compile time, because the checked exception, the compiler already has some idea about what are the different types of exceptions that it might occur during the execution of a program, and accordingly it gives us a check to find out whether we have reported all types of exceptions or different types of exceptions which might occur, or we have handled those exceptions within our program so that the normal flow is not interrupted. However, in unchecked exception, it is not checked at compile time, and it will not check at compile time, and it will try to uh, compile it, not try it actually compiles the program without any problem, but it throws an exception during runtime. Now, in checked exception, we get a compilation error, or we get an error right at the compilation stage saying that there is an unreported exception. However, in unchecked exception, this compilation error is absent. We do not have any error in compilation stage. Directly the exception is thrown, or we get an error at the runtime. Now, in checked exception, we can handle the exception. We have to either handle the exception if a method throws a checked exception, Otherwise, we have to use the throws keyword so that we can specify the exception. That means we can report the exception. Okay. However, no such type of exception declaration is needed in or is done in unchecked exception, because a method is not forced by the compiler to declare the unchecked exception which is thrown by its implementation. The fourth important point that we have to remember is the failure of risk is high, because in checked exceptions, generally this is not happening due to programming mistakes but due to some other mistakes which do not pertains always to the logical concept. Okay. In unchecked exception, it is low in failure risk because it primarily occurs due to certain programming mistakes. Okay, so it occurs due to certain programming mistakes, and hence it is very low in failure risk. The fifth important point is that since checked exception, they are a direct subclass of the exception class, because uh, we already saw that all the compile time exceptions, they basically belong to the exception class, uh, but they do not inherit from runtime exception. Okay, so runtime exception, they have no direct contact with the um, compile time or the checked exceptions. Okay, though both of them inherit the exception class, however your unchecked exception, they are a direct subclass of the runtime exception. So in this particular session, we have discussed about what is an exception, what do we mean by exception handling, what are the different types, or what is the exception hierarchy, and that we discussed about the throwable class, as well as we discussed about exceptions and errors, and out of those exceptions we talked about runtime and compile time exceptions. We also talked about the checked and unchecked exceptions, and we saw with two different programs what are basically checked exception and what are unchecked exceptions. So checked exceptions, they occur during the compile time itself, and we get a compile time error during the compilation stage itself saying that there might be an exception in future. Okay, however in runtime exception, we do not get any such warning message or any such compilation error. It is compiled fine, but we get an exception during the runtime. So this is all about the preliminary concepts of exception handling. In my next video, we will be talking about how can we handle these exceptions and how can we implement the throws keyword in order to declare the different types of exception. Okay, so that is all for this session. Thank you.